Thank you. So I lecture a lot. I usually don't use a microphone. Do you want me to use a microphone, or can you guys hear me in the back?
I can hear you.
All right, so using geoarchaeology to determine the source of the stone pavers in Christchurch. All right, first the outline. I'll introduce you to my co-authors. When we do science these days, we don't ever work in isolation. It takes a team of people with different skill sets. Then we'll describe the stone floor of Christchurch in incredible detail, maybe more detail than you want to know, but you're going to get it all. So you get good dosage when you're explaining this to your visitors. We'll look at the evidence for the source of the stone pavers coming from Khartoum, Robert Carter's mansion, and he, we think, reused those stones from his house here in this church. Then we'll look at the evidence for where the stone pavers came from before Khartoum, and I think we've got really good evidence that they came from the south coast of England based on the fossils in the stone pavers here in the church. Then we'll review quarrying and around the area where it came from in Swanage, England in the 18th century. And then Robert's contribution to the project, Robert Teagle, looking at the historical evidence about where, when, and how these stones were shipped. And then we'll have time for questions at the end. And then if anyone wants to get their knees dirty, I'm happy to go over, Robert, I don't know if that's in the schedule. If you guys have time and interest, we can go over and get on our hands and knees and see if we can find some fossils in the floor. All right, so this is Robert Teagle. So there's something when you take photographs called spherical aberration. It makes fat things look skinny, and I think that's what's going on here. But anyways, he's a great colleague when he does respond to emails. And then our other co-author is Trelevin Hayson. Trelevin is a commercial quarry operator on the south coast of England, and he owns a company, W.J. Hayson and Sons, and his family's been quarrying Purbeck stone for many, many generations, and he'll play a key role in this story later on. Most of the grunt work, though, of getting down on hands and knees with digital cameras and scales and taking lots of pictures was done by my colleagues and students in the Department of Earth Sciences at Dickinson College, and we covered every square inch of your floor of this beautiful church. So they did all the hard work. So why do we care about where these stone pavers came from in Christchurch? Well, to an earth scientist, we call this sourcing. An archaeologist calls it archaeologist calls it sourcing. Earth scientist calls it provenance. What's the provenance, or the source of that material? Because it helps us understand trade routes. For example, when you find Native American artifacts here in the coastal plain of Virginia, there's no local source or provenance for those artifacts. So it tells us about where and how those Native Americans were trading lithic or raw materials to make those tools. So there was a very busy colonial trade, as we know, between England and other parts of Europe and the Americas. And one of the things we are going to argue for today, I have 3 hours, Robert? So hopefully I'll convince you next hour that those stones came from England, put on a ship, and sent back full of tobacco in exchange. So the approach we're going to use is called historical geoarchaeology. So we know what archaeology is. Historical archaeology is using a combination of archaeological evidence that you dig up and historical documentation. And we're rich in that here in the coastal plain of Virginia, especially around the Chesapeake Bay. We have both archaeological evidence and historical documentation, because not a lot of it was burned during the Civil War. Geoarchaeology, on the other hand, uses the analytical science techniques of geology or earth sciences to address archaeological questions. And we're going to apply all three of those techniques here. We're going to do a little bit of archaeology, a little bit of history, thanks to Robert, and a little bit of geology, thanks to me. So beautiful historic Christchurch. A lot of people are drawn to the beautiful brickwork. Other people are drawn to the wooden pulpit and pews. Extraordinary. Others like the interior wooden framing and how the infrastructure of the church was built. But not me, I was drawn to the floor. My dear father, he's over at RWC in bed now, but he and I grew up like this together. And he kind of has the same posture still, doesn't he? And that was all we did, as Father said, is look for fossils together. And so I didn't really notice the bricks or the woodwork or all that beautiful other stuff in the church. I noticed the floors. And I wasn't the only one. This is a quote from Bishop Meade in 1837. Quote, "In further evidence of the fidelity with which the house was built, I would mention that the pavement of its aisles, which is of large freestone, is yet solid and smooth as though it was the work of yesterday." So even back in 1837, people were noticing this gorgeous floor. We know a little bit about the shape of the pavers because some of them have been taken up for repair over the years. They're generally rectangular in shape and they're laid directly on an earthen surface, often sand and clay. Here's a picture from 1983. We get a sense of how thick these stone pavers are. And if we look at a floor plan of a church, here's the altar up here to get oriented. The pavers cover essentially the entire floor space of the transepts, the nave, and the chancel area. So all these pink areas are covered in these stone pavers. But the pews and the altar floors are not. They're made of wood. In addition, David Miles's burial marker here in the middle is not the same stone as the stone pavers. And John Carter's burial marker here in the chancel is also a different stone. So we're only talking about the pink area in the church. It covers, so as a scientist, I do everything in metric units, and so I'll try to use English units today. So it covers about 900, just under 1,000 square feet of area of these stone pavers. We counted them. There's 352 stone pavers in the church. About 92% of them appear to be in their original location and show no signs of a repair. But about 8% suggests that something's happened to them. Maybe they were broken and re-glued or maybe completely replaced. It's often easy to tell because they have different kinds of cement in their joints. Most of the repaired pavers occur in the nave. The chancel has the fewest of these repaired pavers. So here's an example of what a repaired paver looks like. Probably done in the early 1980s. You can see modern cement and you can see non-rectangular joints. Here's one that looks like a mosaic with lots of different pieces, smaller pieces, still the same stone, but clearly they've been repaired and replaced with a more mosaic pattern. We measured the length and width of each of the pavers. And this is what we call a frequency histogram. This is the dimension of one side of the paver in inches, from 1 inch out to 57 inches. And this is the number of pavers of that size, or the frequency of pavers. So there are very few small pavers and there are very few big pavers. This is the typical size of the paver in here. The smallest paver is just under 0.2 square feet in area. The largest paver is a little over 12 square feet. The largest stone pavers lay in the middle of the aisles, and that's partly an artifact that some of the pavers extend underneath the wooden pews. They go in there about 2 inches underneath the wood. The mean paver size is 18.4 inches on a side, and that will become important because back in 1756, in the Virginia Gazetteer, there was an ad placed for someone who wanted to buy stone pavers for the floor of the Capitol in Williamsburg. And here's the quote, size of stone that will best answer is 18 inches square. So this was a common size building stone at the time of building Williamsburg in 1756. So where did these stone pavers come from? Well, earlier writers had suggested that these had come from Khartoum, a beautiful mansion that Robert Carter had built, and that he reused them in Christchurch. Khartoum was a nearby brick mansion built from 1720 to 1725, but unfortunately burnt down in 1729. This is a paper by Hudgens in 1985, some conjectural drawings of what it looked like with the Khartoum River in the background. Beautiful building. We know a lot about Khartoum. It was excavated first in the 1930s by a local amateur, James Wharton. He worked mostly on the west side, so the other parts of the house were not disturbed by his amateur but important efforts. And then we had some professional archaeologists come in 1969, Ivor Noel Hume, and then later in 1976, William Kelso did the most extensive archaeological survey of the site. The last really major work was done by Carter Hudgens, 1977 to 1980, and this was the biggest archaeological excavation in Khartoum. What you can see here is the English or half basement, and in front of it was the arcaded loggia. These were both completely covered with stone pavers. So here's from that 1985 publication. Here you can see the very top of the windows of the English half basement here, and then this is the arcaded loggia here. So there's no written documentation, and Roberts looked really hard to see if the stone pavers were ever brought over from Khartoum into Christchurch. But there's no historic evidence for that. But we're going to present 10 pieces of circumstantial evidence that I think will convince you that they were reused from Khartoum. First of all, number one is the timing. The timing is perfect. Khartoum burns down in 1729, which just predates the construction of Christchurch. We know that Carter did not rebuild Khartoum, so those stones are sitting there in that burned out shell of a house. Christchurch begins about 1730, right after the fire. So the pavers were available if he wanted to reuse them. So once again, circumstantial evidence. And all the evidence we're going to provide is circumstantial. We have no historical record that says Carter did this. We know from the interpretations from Hudgens' archaeological excavation that Robert Carter had begun salvaging items from the ruins. So we know that they were using materials from the ruins, but no one mentions the stone pavers themselves. Carter dies in 1732. The salvage work continues, and the archaeology stratigraphy of the ceramics suggests that the whole thing was buried in and filled in about 1770, and all the borrowing of materials was ceased at that point. The second piece of evidence is that both this church and Khartoum were owned by the same man. So it would be economically, financially, legally, not a burden to transfer them from one construction site to another. Here's a map of Christchurch Yard. Here's Route 646 up here. Here's the modern day church. Here's the brick wall. This is where we think the 1670 church was located. And in archaeological excavations in 2006, where they were looking for that 1670 church, they found some floor tiles. These are ceramic floor tiles that they think were the floor of the original brick church. These were fired ceramic earthenware floor tiles. And then Harpole et al., in interpreting that excavation, said, quote, "It's surprising given the size of the tiles recovered and their likely extensive use within the 1670 church that a denser pattern of tiles was not found. This suggests that many of the tiles originally in the church were removed and used elsewhere, with perhaps only the broken ones discarded on site. It's tempting to think that these tiles may have been brought to Khartoum or another of the Carter family's properties, as Robert Carter was the undertaker for the new church and was given the liberty to use whatever the old church he might find useful." So this suggests that the Carters had a history of reusing materials from one site to another. And in fact, these kinds of raw materials, ceramics, brick, and stone, are very rare in the coastal plain of Virginia around the Chesapeake. And so they were a valuable resource, not to just be left in the ground. The third piece of circumstantial evidence is that, wow, these two locations are really close together. It would make logistics very easy to transfer those heavy stone pavers from one site to the other, even maybe by water up on a barge. The water before siltation of these streams, from tobacco farming, these streams would have had water, much navigable water, much closer to Christchurch. But even so, you could put them on wagons and get in there. It's only about 2 miles from Khartoum to Christchurch. The fourth piece of circumstantial evidence is that we have very good historical documentation of other kinds of goods being ordered from England for the construction of Christchurch, but there's no documentation of ordering paving stones. We got documentation of everything else, but no evidence of paving stones. That suggests that he didn't need to order paving stones because he's going to reuse them from Christchurch. Here's a letter from 1720. Robert Carter ordered for Khartoum 1,000 foot of BD paver. BD stands for best dressed. That means the stones were manually worked and finished into rectangles back in England at the quarry. And pavois, or paver, is a paving stone. So we have historical evidence of Carter ordering 1,000 square feet of pavers for Khartoum, but not for Christchurch. Number 5, all but 10% of the original 700 stone pavers in Khartoum were removed. And so they were available for use in Christchurch. This is the final archaeological site photograph taken in November 1978. And you can see some of the stone pavers are left, but most of them have been removed. Only about 57 of the original estimated 700 pavers remain, less than 10%. You can actually see the locations of the missing pavers. So this is we're zooming in on this area right here. The people in the front, maybe you can see all these little rectangles. These rectangles are not artifacts of the excavation process. These are showing where the mortar was that held these pavers together, different kind of sand. Number 6, the total area of pavers in Khartoum was 2,600 square feet, which is far greater than the 950 square feet in Christchurch, which suggests there's more than enough pavers in Khartoum. Once again, we use we use this photograph and this scale model to measure the area of the stone pavers. The 7th piece of circumstantial evidence, not just looking at the area, but the number of pavers. About 640 pavers were removed from Khartoum, and there are only 352 pavers in Christchurch. So there's plenty of stone pavers from Khartoum. And we counted them using this final photograph. Number 8, the size of the pavers in Khartoum is similar to that in Christchurch. So we measured the ones that were in place, we measured the remnants that were left behind, and guess what? They're 18 inches in on a side, on average. Roughly 12 inches by 18 inches, and the larger ones are about 18 inches by 18 inches. So, the average size of the stone pavers in Christchurch almost identically matches the average size of the stone pavers in Khartoum. Number 9. Both Khartoum and the Christchurch pavers show possible signs of damage by fire. So if you look at this photograph, you see these dark areas here, some more over here, more over there. The archaeologists interpreted those as the last remnants of the fire as the house burned down, as the timbers collapsed into the basement and continued to burn. So you can see some of that evidence of the fire on the stone pavers here. And there's evidence of lead on the stone pavers. So Hudgens in 1985 reported lumps and drops of what appear to be melted lead on some of the stone pavers. And he actually made a map of the distribution of lead on the floor of Khartoum. So this is the outline of Khartoum. Here's the English half basement. Here's the arcaded loggia. And these different symbols, that symbol means there was no lead found there. And these different symbols represent different numbers of lead artifacts preserved. The archaeologists attributed to lead used in glass windows, and lead gutters and downspout, and lead flashings on the roof of Khartoum. They mapped these at a 1 square foot cell size. There's 3,009 cells here. 447 of them are brick foundations, and the other 2,562 potentially had melted lead in them. 63% lacked any melted lead fragments, but 37% did. So, due to the presence of lead in the archaeological site, Robert and I decided to look for lead on the stone pavers here in Christchurch. And we found 9 samples of what we thought were lead on the stone pavers. Here are 4 of them on the north transept. So they look like this. If you get down on your hands and knees, you see these strange looking blobs on the surface. Some, we thought maybe some of them were chewing gum or whatever. Here, 3 more from the north, from the nave. Here's sample 8 from the south transept. Here's one from the chancel. And then we're going to compare the chemistry of those to see if they're lead with the sample of a floor stone that doesn't have lead. So that's our control. And here are 9 samples from the floor of Christchurch. Here's our control sample. And we ran them through an energy dispersive scanning electron microscope. It's a fancy machine that tells you the chemical composition of things. And we compared it to galena, which is a lead-based mineral. Over half of the samples that Robert and I thought were lead turned out to be lead. Now, we don't know if it's lead from the Khartoum fire, or back in the day they used to use lead-based paint, so maybe it's just a splot of paint that's there that has lead in it, or some other contaminant. But it suggests that maybe some of that lead on the stone pavers in Christchurch is from the lead from the fire at Khartoum. So, the stone pavers in Christchurch, I think, were probably reused from Khartoum. But where did they come from before that? And so that's where my expertise comes in as a paleontologist. I can try to determine the source of things based on the rock type. So the most famous example of this is what we did in Stonehenge. Stonehenge, they determined, came from rocks way out here in southwestern Wales, up to 240 miles away, because there are no rocks like that around Stonehenge. They had to be imported in. And there are lots of ways to use geoarchaeological techniques to determine the provenance or source of something. You can do molecular level analysis or mineral level analysis. What we did is rock level analysis. We're going to use the fossils in the stone pavers to determine where they came from. And so when you get down on your hands and knees, you see these kind of black things against this beige outline. Those are the fossils. The problem is there are no stones in this part of Virginia. So this is a geologic map of Virginia. Here we are at Christchurch. We are in what's called the Coastal Plain Physiographic Province. It consists of unconsolidated young sediments. By young, I mean less than 100 million year old sediments sitting on a very old core of North America. These sediments are not lithified. They're not turned into rock, so you can't use them for stone pavers. There are no local sources for these rocks. The closest rocks that are being possibly used for pavers are up near Fredericksburg, in a little town of Achaia, just north of Fredericksburg. If you're on I-95 sitting in traffic on a Sunday afternoon headed back into DC, you go by the Achaia exit, right? What's that?
Acquire.
Acquire. Acquire.
We'll correct you.
Up in Pennsylvania where I come from, you say Achaia.
5 4 times.
So shut up. So it's only about 75 miles up the Rappahannock River you come to these stones. And they were quarried. Here's the Achaia sandstone quarry. And it was used extensively as a building stone from 1750 to 1840. Here's the stone used in the Achaia Church. The White House is almost 100% built of Achaia stone. The older wing of the Capitol is built of Achaia stone, and the U.S. Treasury as well. Robert and I, this is a project we're still working on. We think that these little elements in the stores, the doors and windows here at Christchurch are made of that same stone. And that's a manuscript we're working on. And that also includes the steps going up to the doors are also made of that Achaia stone. But these Achaia stones are Cretaceous, so they're from a paleontological perspective, they're very young, and they're made of sandstone. And they don't contain fossils like we see in the limestone of Christchurch floor. The closest limestones to Christchurch are way out here in the Blue Ridge Physiographic Province, the Valley and Ridge Physiographic Province on the other side of the Blue Ridge. And there's still commercial quarrying going on today. Here's a big quarry over there in the Shenandoah Valley, and the Fraser Bluestone Quarry. But when this church was being built in the 1730s, how much knowledge would they have had of that stone? And how are they going to get it all the way down here into the tidewater? That was problematic. Transportation is easy up to what we call the fall line. The fall line is defined by the boundary between the Piedmont Physiographic Province and the coastal plain. So these are unconsolidated sediments. These are hard metamorphic rocks. And so these estuaries that come up into the Piedmont, when they reach the Piedmont, they're waterfalls. And that's where the cities, that's where the ships had to stop. They unloaded, they built dams for the mills, and that's where Baltimore and DC and Fredericksburg and Richmond and Petersburg are all located on that fall line. So these stones, these possible limestones from way out here are on the other side of the fall line. Plus, they are really old, 300 million years old, and they have the wrong fossils in them. So that's not a possible source. So if there are no local sources of rock around here in Virginia, where did the stone pavers come from? Clearly they had to be imported. They were importing a lot of things from England, so why not stone pavers? A very low value import item, but it also could double as ballast in your ship. Here's a quote from James Wharton's 1950 book, King Carter the Man. Quote, "If Khartoum is at the mouth of Carter's Creek, which is one of the finest anchorages in all tidewater, there he can watch the ships which connect with the nearest shopping center, England." So this is Robert King Carter version of going to Amazon and ordering whatever he wants. Right? It was done by letter, by ship to England, and Robert's got those historic documents of that trade. So the key to where those stone pavers came from is in these fossils. These are pictures from the floor of Christchurch. So we all know what oysters are. Oysters are a type of bivalve, a kind of mollusk that has two valves or two shells, right? Most bivalves, like clams, have symmetrical valves or symmetrical shells. So this clam has died and is opened up like this, and you can see the two valves or two shells, and there's a hinge that holds them together. This belongs to a genus called Neomyodon. It's about 1 inch across for perspective. So you're going to have to get down on your hands and knees to see these things. Here's another fossil we found here in Christchurch. Praexogyra distorta. It's a kind of oyster. It's about 1.5 inches across. Turns out, so we have this great database called the PDB, the Paleontological Database, and it's as a paleontologist describes a new fossil, they enter it in this database, what it is, where it was found, and what age is it. And so you can put your fossils into this database and search it, and it has fossils all over the world, and it'll tell you that if you have these two species, the only place on the planet where these two species of fossils co-occur in time and place is in the Purbeck Formation in England. So these stones are definitely from Purbeck, from England. And here's that oyster, and there's the clam. All right, so we were able to identify this clam and this oyster. They're from a very specific time, what we call the intermarine member of the Durlston Formation of the Purbeck Limestone Group. So here's the intermarine member of the Durlston Formation of the Middle Purbeck beds of the Purbeck Limestone of the Berasian series of the Cretaceous period. So these two species of animals lived 140 to 145 million years ago, and they coexisted in what is now the south coast of England. So this is what the Purbeck limestone looks like in England. This is what beach in Australia looks like after a closely related species has have a mass kill event during a big storm. So you can imagine a big storm washing up these clams onto the beach. They die, their valves open up, and they get preserved as limestone. And that's what happened 140 to 145 million years ago in England. That part of England is now called the Jurassic Coast. It's a World Heritage Site. It's right here along the south coast of England on the English Channel. It's got beautiful history. Here's Corfe Castle from about AD 1000. Corfe Castle is also made of Purbeck stone. Not the same layer as Christchurch stones. These are much bigger stones. We'll talk about where the Christchurch pavers came from here in a second. The Jurassic Coast is also famous for its spectacular geology, especially along this section of the coast. There's beautiful Lulworth Cove. This is all Purbeck limestone outcropping here. Folded Purbeck beds of what's called the crumble. Durdle Door. These are all chock full of the same fossils that you have on the floor of your church. Further to the west, slightly older, we have East Clift on West Bay. Slightly younger, we have Old Hairy Rocks in the Cretaceous chalk. Beautiful beach pebbles. And I want to zoom in on this part of the map. we are near a little town of Swanage. This pattern here shows where the Purbeck limestone is exposed at the surface. So these are the places where you could quarry it. Oh, here we are relative to London. Okay, so south central England. If we zoom in on a geologic map, we're interested in this middle Purbeck formation. And this is an old 1926 topographic map. The people in the front can see all these little patterns. These are quarries at the surface where they have surface access to the limestones below. So this place is riddled with quarries. Here's an aerial photo showing the English Channel down here. Here's the coast. Here's Swanage Harbor. I don't know if you can see this, but there are layers of limestone sticking out into the ocean here. And we're going to go down to that beach and walk along that beach here. You can see the limestones coming along here. And we're going to this part of the coast where it says the upper building stones, the intermarine member. Here it is coming down to the beach, so you can walk along the beach and you can intersect these layers. And we're interested in these two units. The commercial quarry operators number every layer of rock. This is layer 125, or DB 125, also called the roach. And this is the DB 113, also called down vein. And these are particular in their thickness, which makes them perfect for paving stones. Other layers were used for other uses, we'll see here in a second, but these were the two that were the perfect thickness, about 4 inches, for paving stones. So here's DB 125, the roach. And here I am dragging my family out to sample it. My daughter here is Lily. How old are you now, Lily? 25. This is Lily's 18th birthday. She was so excited to go. We went into these really muddy quarries, and it was she loved it, right? So there it is. There's DB 125. And look at that. You can see the thickness of these beds. It's perfect for stone pavers. This is called, this local DB 125 layer is called by the local quarrymen the roach or thornback. Below that is the DB 113, the downs vein. Once again, perfect thickness for paving stones. When we were there, we found these strange holes that had been drilled into the rock face. These are done for Paleomagnetic Analysis. When you have iron minerals in sediment, they align themselves with the Earth's magnetic field. And the Earth's magnetic field is parallel at the equator and perpendicular at the poles. So if you can measure the magnetic orientation of the rocks, you can tell what latitude they formed in. And when you do that, so here we are, we're in the early Cretaceous, 140 million years ago. Here's North America, here's South America, still attached to Africa. Here's the Mediterranean, here's Spain, here's England, and they're 32 degrees north, based on those paleomagnetic samples. So 140 million years ago, southern England was at 32 degrees north. Today it's at 50 degrees north. So in those 140 million years, England has moved northward. And look what you find at DB 125, those exact same clamshells that we have in Christchurch. These are the neomyodine clams. Look at that. Here's 2 of them from England. Here's 2 from Christchurch. Do you believe me? Here's an oyster. This is an oyster in DB 125, Christchurch. Here's cross-sections of the oyster in Christchurch, cross-sections of the oyster in England. Now the Purbeck stone is quarried extensively there for lots of uses. It's used to build castles, like we see here. Those are the thicker blocks. It's also used for stone pavers, the ones that are intermediate thickness. So this is our co-author's driveway. It's made of Purbeck stone pavers, just like Christchurch. The thinnest slabs are used for making roofs. Robert, aren't you glad you didn't have to replace this Christchurch roof? This is a very heavy roof. In 1724, Daniel Defoe wrote that Purbeck stone was, quote, used in London in great quantities for paving courtyards, alleys, avenues to houses, kitchens, footways on the sides of high streets and the like. So at the same time that Christchurch is being built, people are using Purbeck stone to pave London. Purbeck stone is also used in other English colonies in the Americas, not just here at Christchurch. We have evidence of their use in the Maryland State House from 1678, a 17th century cemetery in Barbados, 17th century use in Jamaican forts, 18th century headstones in Newfoundland, and 18th century stone pavers in the Charleston courthouse. So it was a commonly imported stone. It was also used in the Williamsburg Capitol. That same 1756 advertisement that was calling for those 18-inch square stone pavers explicitly asked for Purbeck. So in 1756, people in Virginia were known, Purbeck stone was known as an in-demand stone paver. We also found evidence of its use in Jamestown Church. Here's one of these. What's the technical term, Robert, for these kind of horizontal tombstones? A ledger?
Headstone?
Headstone. Okay. This is a headstone or ledger here outside of the Jamestown Church, and there's that oyster. Here we are at Ware Church in Gloucester County, Virginia. These stone pavers in the sidewalks. Same oyster. The Purbeck stone is not a fine-grained stone for carving. It's a modest stone for stone pavers. It's not something you'd use in a cathedral. There is something called Purbeck marble. It's not a marble. In the stone industry, they use terms differently than an earth scientist would. A marble is a metamorphic rock of limestone that's been heated and squished. This is just a limestone full of beautiful snail fossils. So this is a nice stone that's used in places like the Salisbury Cathedral in England. It's also used, that Purbeck marble is also used at Mount Airy in Richmond County, Virginia. These little squares are made of that stone. And these are Portland stone. Now that's a fine, carvable building stone. So back in the early 1700s, how were these stone pavers quarried? They didn't have access to heavy machinery. It was done by brute force. And here's some historical drawings of what these Purbeck stone quarries look like. Here's one from 1882. You see this capstan with a chain going down to a sled on wheels with a piece of Purbeck stone on it, and a donkey winding up the capstan. So here's the capstan, here's the chain, there's the sled with the Purbeck stone being pulled out of the underground quarry, and here's the donkey that turns the capstan. So the quarrying would have been done on the subsurface. They didn't have heavy machinery to clear off the surface to get to the stone, so it was all done in the subsurface. So this is Lily on her 18th birthday. Look at that smile. You can almost hear it. Thanks for taking me into this wet, dirty mine, Dad, on my 18th birthday. Can you hear it? There are bats down there. And there it is. There's the DB113, the Downs vein. That's the one that's got the fossils in Christchurch. Now, we can't say it came from this exact quarry or this exact mine, but it came from this exact location. Now, all this mining is done at the surface. It's a lot cheaper, a lot safer, with heavy machinery. Here's another reconstruction, and I had my children do it. Here's the capstan, and there's the chain pulling up the sled. Here's a 1925 photograph of the quarrymen dressing the stone at the site, making them into the stone pavers. Where I teach at Dickinson College, we were founded in 1783. We have beautiful old limestone buildings from much older limestone. But whenever we do new construction, we hire these old Italian guys that sit there with these same tools in 2018 and work it by hand. You can't produce that same texture with the machine. Today, this is that guy Haysom. He cuts his stone. He doesn't. It's too expensive to hire people to work them by hand. They cut them into nice slabs, and their slabs can be a lot thinner. So, here's Purbeck stones used in England just like Christchurch. Even the texture that they put into the stones. You can see this perimeter. This is in England. This is in Christchurch. You can see that same perimeter. So the technique is the same. I don't want to talk about this. Okay, so how did they get these stones? We saw how they got out of the ground. How did they get it to Virginia? Well, they were probably loaded on small boats, rowed out to a bigger ship offshore, probably in Swanage Bay. And the ships that could get in this bay were too small for transatlantic voyage, so they were sent to another port, or transshipped, out of a larger port where they have seagoing vessels. So the pictures of us with the limestones are along this coast here. The quarries are up here on this hill, and this is Swanage Bay. So they're probably loaded into boats here. Here's Swanage Bay. Here's where we found those fossils along this cliff here. This is what the harbor looks like today. They were probably either transshipped out of Poole Harbor or Weymouth. And I'll provide evidence for both, but most likely it was out of Weymouth. So Poole Harbor is only 9 miles north, and that's where they have Atlantic shipping size ships. Here's a Poole Harbor map from 1860. Here's Swanage Harbor. Here's where the quarries were, still are. And here's Poole Harbor, 9 miles to the north. Here's a photograph of it today. You get access to the English Channel through here. Here's a photograph of about 1900 with the tall masted ships. This is what it looks like today. It's no longer a commercial port, just some pleasure boaters. More likely, the quarried stone was put on smaller ships and sent to Weymouth, which is about twice as far, 19 miles to the west, and there it was put on bigger ships. And Robert has found historical evidence for this. So Carter is writing to London to order things. In 1720, Carter placed 2 orders for stone pavers from his main contact in London, Edward Tucker. It's amazing. All this stuff is digitized and available online, both in Richmond and in London. Tucker was a merchant. He was sometimes the mayor of Weymouth. He was also a member of Parliament, so this guy was a mover and shaker. Tucker also held the office as surveyor of His Majesty's quarries. So this guy knew the quarry industry. So if Carter wanted paving stone for his Khartoum to be later reused in Christchurch, this is the man to contact. He did sell Portland stone to Carter for his pavers. Portland stone is a very fine-grained limestone. It's very homogeneous, so it's easily carvable. It's used in lots of architecture in London, such as St. Paul's Cathedral here. Tucker owned a fleet of at least 4 ships: the Brimton, the Georgia Mary, the Portland, and the Princess Amelia. And we have the records. The guy sitting there kept track of what ship came in and what was on it, and what ship went out, who was the captain of it, and what was on it. And all those records are now digitized. We have evidence that Tucker regularly imported tobacco from Robert Carter into Weymouth, also into Poole, and they exported English manufactured goods back to Carter. Based on the frequency, so we know when and how often these ships are going in and out of England, based on the frequency that the Princess Amelia, the Brimpton, and the Robert and John entered and exited the ports of Weymouth and Poole together on the same dates, carrying in convoy Virginia tobacco, the Tucker probably also owned the Robert and John. There's no historical evidence that we could find that he owned those ships. But that ship, the Robert and John, almost always sailed with his other ships, Princess Amelia, Brimpton, and Robert and John. Interesting, just to hypothesize, where did he get those names for that ship? Robert and John. In one letter written on 27 May 1721, Carter wrote to Tucker, quote, "I have received yours by Captain Russell and Wilson. The latter had 15 weeks' passage by stress of weather. He was forced to heave overboard 300 to 400 foot of my stones. We found a record in England for Tucker's ship, the Brimpton, captained by Giles Russell, departing Weymouth on the 1st of February, 1721, bound for Virginia. This is 16 weeks before Carter's letter referring to the 15-week voyage. So we're pretty confident the stones went to Swanage, to Weymouth, to Khartoum to be used in Carter's Khartoum mansion. The reference in Carter's letter to a Captain Wilson accompanying Captain Russell. So Captain Wilson and went with Captain Russell. Suggests that the Brimpton sailed in convoy with the Robert and John, as this is the only other Tucker ship piloted by a Captain Wilson, in this case Thomas Wilson. So once again, it's all circumstantial pieces of evidence, but it fits together, I think, in a pretty convincing story. So this is what Weymouth Harbor looked like in 1635. Here's the English Channel. Here's the entrance to the harbor. This is what it looks like today. Here's an ocean-going ship going into Weymouth in the fog. This is one of the many ways to get to France across the English Channel. There's a fast ferry that sails out of Weymouth. This is what it looked like back in the day. This is what it looked like today. Still lots of pleasure boats, but also commercial boats. They have a lot of nice pubs there, Robert.
I don't like pubs, Marcus, you know that.
And no IPAs.
Oh.
No double IPAs. No triple IPAs.
Research trip.
They do have seafood, but the crabs aren't as good, and the oysters aren't as good as down here. So what type of ship was used? There are two possible sizes of ships, a sloop and a brigantine. A sloop is smaller. It can take 25 to 70 tons of cargo. It's not as fast, but it can hold quite a bit of cargo. This bigger ship, the brigantine, is double-masted. At the midpoint of the ship, it only has 3 feet of freeboard. So if you're oystering or crabbing, you typically try to minimize the freeboard so it's easier to get the dredges or the crab pots on. But that's not good for allowing waves to wash over your ship. So it was probably a brigantine that they were sailing, and that's why they had to throw some of the stone overboard in that storm. So I hope I've convinced you that Robert Carter ordered the stone pavers in 1720 from Edward Tucker, Weymouth, England. They were quarried by hand in a shallow mine. Based on those 2 species of fossil clam and oyster, they were quarried from a particular 2 beds of the intermarine member of the Durlston Formation of the Permian Limestone Group, deposit of 150 million contained period. They were then shipped from Swanage to Weymouth. On the 1st of February 1721, they left for Virginia on the Brigantine captained by Giles Russell. During the transatlantic voyage, some of the stone was thrown overboard during a storm to lighten the load. They arrived at Khartoum on the 27th of May, 1721. Robert and Carter installed them in the basement, the English half basement in the arcaded loggia of Khartoum in the summer of 1721. Khartoum was finally finished in 1725, but unfortunately burned down in 1729. If it hadn't been, you guys would all be working over there. Or at least half of you be working there and half of you be working in Christchurch. The stone pavers were salvaged from Khartoum and reused in Christchurch when construction began in 1730. So that's the end of our Purbeck story. We were living in, my family was living in Norwich, England at the time, in kind of southeast England. And after that, we had to drive home. So we had a nice, relaxing drive home.
Oh, dude.
On these really wide English roads. I felt like I was driving on the Autobahn. And we stopped in Oxford on the way home. And we went to a pub called the Eagle and Child pub. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Eagle and Child. C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien used to like to drink beer there. And they, in the 1950s, laid out their upcoming books, Narnia and The Lord of the Rings, in this pub. So we had a nice pub lunch there. A few blocks down is the Ashmolean Museum of Oxford University. And there we got to see the 1608 shell map that Powhatan gave to Smith. It's a deerskin mantle. That really should be returned to the Americas, but not yet. Our ongoing work, Robert and I, so a year from now I have a sabbatical coming up. So I'm going to be working on trying to nail down the source of these stone steps to the Aquia.
Very good.
And I'm working on the sources of these tombstones. It's hard to convince historians and archaeologists to take samples because I need to whack off a piece of this rock and thin section it and look at it under a microscope to determine the fossils. The archaeologists or historians have given us access to the Knight's Tomb at Jamestown. We have samples from there. There's a beautiful church in Williamsburg. We've got samples from Ware Church. Robert gave us permission to sample this crack in John Carter's tomb inside, so we have a sample from there, but he's not let me sample these yet. But don't you think he should? Right, whoever thinks he should let me sample him, raise your hand. All right, I'm not putting any pressure on you. But in these black stones are protists, a kind of single-celled organism. There are also some micro snails and corals, and most importantly, bryozoans, which are the animals I work on. So there we go. I've got 4 minutes left. Any questions for me? Yes, sir.
And it's not central to your presentation, but early on you said that the Purbeck, that the stone of the David Miles marker is not the same. Can you elaborate on the differences between that stone and the rest of it?
Yeah, so I can visually look at it, but I didn't see any fossils in it, and I'm hesitant to ask to whack off a piece. You can, oftentimes, Robert and I were able to get access to the bottoms of things. You know, we could sample this, take off this piece of wood, and we could sample the back of that. You know, and then cover it back up, and no one would know. And for the advance of science, I think we should.
Robert can go to the local, and we'll get on with this.
So I don't know what kind of stone that is. I've not sampled that.
And is it a polished? Well, we can argue over later. It seems to me to be polished before engraving.
Let's look at it after this talk. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have an idea of how much they weigh?
How much the stones weigh? No, I don't, but that would be very easy to calculate based on the dimensions and the density of calcite, which is the dominant mineral in limestone. I could do that calculation. We did not do that. Maybe from a shipping perspective, that would be very important to know. Yeah, but no, I do not know. Yes, ma'am.
You know the number of stones that were in Robert Carter's home, and you know that some are here. Can you add up all the other stones that have come around to figure out where they all disappeared or gone to or were sold?
Yeah,
Or used?
there are
Okay.
stories of other people having these stones around. In fact, there's another building at Khartoum that survives that has some of those stones in it. Robert, can you help me out?
I think Carter Hudgens' report says it was ironic that the summer they were there, they were using a garage kind of as their lab, and the whole garage, right, was paved in it. And if you go down there today, you'll still see more stones. They look more like stones like for the steps that are sitting there. They're lying on the surface down at Khartoum today. So, like Marcus said, they were harvested early on, but people probably came back at some point in the early 20th century. They still may have been pulling some, because that building was like a 1950s or 60s garage.
Yeah, so we do know that there are other stones out there. We've never calculated how many there are. Yeah, good question. Yes, ma'am.
Several years ago, when I was doing a group tour, one of the guests was from that area,
Oh, neat.
and he emphasized how expensive that stone was even then, and how expensive it is today.
Wow. Yeah, it seems crazy to put stone in a ship and send it across the ocean. You know, I could see that for a nice teacup or something. But paving stone, it's dollar value per unit weight. It's got to be one of the lowest things. But if they can use it as ballast in the ship,
Yeah, because I was bringing up, I said, probably this was used as ballast before I could continue. He said, whoa, that wasn't the real purpose of it. I know, because it was much too expensive for that.
right? But if you can make a buck by selling your ballast at the end of the trip,
Well, and this was a man who could afford that.
yeah. Carter, yeah. Yes,
So
sir.
what was the point of dressing the stone? You can see all those chisel marks. Is it just taking the imperfections out? Or
Yes.
is it,
yeah.
Make it smooth.
To make it flat.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so
the
people
bottom
walk on
side,
it.
if you notice in
Yeah.
the pictures, they did not do that, just the top surface.
all right.
Yeah. And it appears to be a pattern of like a 1-inch border that's a different orientation chisel mark than the interior of each stone.
I remember you told me, you know that it has to be handmade because those marks would not run perpendicular, right, over millions of years.
Right. Yeah, they're clearly handmade.
Clearly been handmade.
I don't sympathise with your family having to go to Lola from Swanage because it is one of the most beautiful parts of the South.
You talk funny.
Yeah, you talk funny.
I don't have any accent, actually. Where are you from, sir?
Well, I'm from South of England.
South of England.
Yeah,
It was a great trip.
It was.
I'm sure it was. It's a lovely part of the world.
It is.
You didn't have the picture of the grad students in the pub with you. You deleted that.
I'm trying to improve my image. So, yeah. So there's a letter that Carter talks about importing Dorchester ale. Some ridiculous amount, like so many. It was equivalent to like 232 kegs of Dorchester ale, and I'm a very thorough scientist, so I wanted to sample Dorchester ale over there, and it got better after the fourth.
The third.
Yes, sir.
Would the Purbeck shine, polish up like marble, like water shine, mirror shine?
Would what polish up like
Purbeck
marble?
shine up like marble?
No, sir. No, it's too coarse. It's too porous. You need a. I don't think any of these are original. But if you look at the Carter tombstone in the chancel, it's a very high density, fine grained limestone that can take a polish. Yeah, but not Purbeck stone.
Great, Marcus, that was wonderful. Judith, why don't you ask your question, because you got left